We have a great episode in store for you tonight as we're going to talk about the first decade of the National Football League and the best players to play in that decade, both from the Hall of Fame and a couple modern experts and their opinions. It's all coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And welcome to an edition where we're going to go back in time a little bit, go back 100 some years and almost 100 years, and talk about the all-decade teams of the NFL, the 1920s. A little bit of history on this. In the 1960s, when the Pro Football Hall of Fame was being established, they thought it would be kind of a cool exercise to go back in the previous 6 decades and go through and put who the best players were for each decade. So in the 1960s, they came up with a 1920s team, a 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s teams as part of the celebration to start the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But it's kind of interesting is the 1920s one, the first 10 years of the National Football League. Because if you remember correctly in your history lesson, the September 17th, 1920 meeting in Ralph Hayes' Hupmobile showroom in Canton, Ohio, that's what kicked off the NFL, and that 1920 season was the first one as the American Professional Football Association, APFA, for the first 2 years until it was renamed in 1922 to the National Football League as we know it. Well, it's kind of interesting the players that they selected for the 1920 all-decade team some 4 decades later. Jimmy Conzelman, Patty Driscoll were the quarterbacks. Then at halfbacks, you had Red Grange, Joe Guyon, and Jim Thorpe and Curly Lambeau. Fullback, Ernie Nevers. The ends were Guy Chamberlain and Lavi Dilwig. George Hallis was also on that list of ends. The tackles were Pete Henry, Steve Owen, and Cal Hubbard, and Ed Healy. The guards were Walt Kiesling, Mike Michalski, Hunk Anderson, and at center, George Trafton. Remember, this is single platoon football, so you played both sides of the ball. The positions were very similar, called on both sides, except for, of course, the quarterback, but that would end up being in the defensive backfield and such. But that's how they called out the positions in 1920. That was the team that they selected. Now, every single one of those people, remember, this is for the Pro Football Hall of Fame's inauguration. All those people I just mentioned are in the Hall of Fame, except for 2. Hunk Anderson and Lavi Dilwig are not in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, even to this day. Some 65 years later, 60 some years later, after the Hall of Fame's inception, they're still not in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Interesting. Well, the other interesting thing is recently, over the last couple years, we've had a couple of historians that have gone through and picked out their selections, take a look at what the Pro Football Hall of Fame selected, and decided to take a look at it and make some tweaks to this Hall of Fame class that they put together back in the 1960s. So today we're diving into the foundational decade with a fresh perspective from Ken Crippen, founder and lead instructor of the Football Learning Academy and renowned authority on pro football history, previous leader of the PFRA, if you remember, also a personal friend of mine. And it was in a piece that was written by Clark Judge just a few years ago on his talkoffame2.com website. Also, we're going to look at John Turney, who we've had on this program before, who runs the Pro Football Journal, very good site as well, and a very good historian as well, just like Ken Crippen is. And these 2 gentlemen each independently wrote articles or talked in an interview to Clark Judge, as Ken Crippen did, to describe who they feel should be removed and who should stay and who should be added to these all-decade teams. These all-decade teams, really, if you think about it, and this has sort of come to light to me over the last few years, is really probably more substantial than who is in the Hall of Fame, because these are, you know, the closer we are to them, let's say at least the 1970s on up to the 2010s that have already been selected. Those are being selected by sports journalists in that era and Hall of Fame ballot getters in that era, and really goes on some of the stats. So back in the 1920s, this is sort of look at that in hindsight, and made many years, many decades later. So, John Turney is a respected researcher and historian in his own right, and weighed in on the subject in 2025 on his Pro Football Journal blogspot.com. So the ends, now Ken Crippen uh, suggests that you have to have at least 4 years of NFL play in the decade to be selected. I think that's a pretty good criteria to use. So in the 1920s, that eliminates a personal favorite because of writing about the Pottsville Maroons recently with Jeffrey Payne. Charlie Berry, he is eliminated. He only played 2 seasons in the NFL. And it also takes out a few other ones that you would consider. But he thinks that Tilly Voss and Eddie Anderson would make the list as second team selections behind leaving Lavi Dilweg and Guy Chamberlain on the first team. So Ken decided to go first team and second team on all his selections. Well, John Turney, he concurs with the three names that Crippen suggests, and Dilweg, Chamberlain, and the addition of Voss. So what that does at the ends is that it eliminates George Halas, and it's really a good point that they make, because George Halas was not known for so much for his football prowess, a very good football player indeed, but probably not one of the best ends in football history of the 1920s. But he got under the merit of his ownership and being a coach and the successes he had there all combined, which still should be in the Football Hall of Fame, but not as a position in the all-decade team that they're talking about. These are position candidates only. So I agree with them removing George Halas and leaving Chamberlain and Dilweg on there, putting Tilly Voss on. And I don't have a problem either with what Ken is saying by adding the other player there too as Mr. Voss. Now let's go to the tackles. Now the tackles that Cal Hubbard is one that they both had a little bit of a problem with, and I don't disagree. He was a legendary figure, an excellent player, and his inclusion as a tackle for this specific period presents a little bit of problem because he only played 3 seasons of the 1920s, and more significantly, the historical records that he was predominantly an end in those 3 years. So the 4 year criteria, he gets eliminated because of that. And he really didn't play the position anyway that he's being selected for at tackle. So the roles of the linemen were often, they were fluid in early football, and they could, because tackles could run the ball, they could do a little bit more than they can in the modern game. But the traditional tackle designation is where they lined up. So another name that's removed off of there is Steve Owen, whose fame and merit as a coach may have propelled him past some of the more deserving tackles, and also suggests for removal by both Ken and John in this case. In their place, Ken suggests Duke Slater and Link Lyman at tackle, second team selections, and John Turney agrees with them. So the tackles in their agreement says that Healy, Pete Henry, Link Lyman, and Duke Slater are the 4 tackles that should go on there. I fully agree and support what they're saying there too. I think they're right on with bringing Slater and Lyman on there and removing Hubbard and Healy, who were good players. I'm sorry, not Healy, Hubbard and Steve Owen. Both good players, but really, if you're looking at to be consistent with the eligibility factors that Ken brought up, I think that's a very fair way to do this. Now at the guard position, the Hall of Fame chose Walt Kiesling, Mike Michalski, and Hunk Anderson. Now, Ken has said, multiple times that, Hunk Anderson and Walt Kiesling had significant tenures during this decade, but Kiesling's peak performance leaned more towards the 1930s, and he often played tackle in the 1920s, and leading to his exclusion. Similarly, Hunk Anderson had some notable contributions and stronger choices emerged in this elite group, resulting in his removal from contentions. The Mahalski stays on there in the place of Kiesling and Hunk Anderson. They are putting Al Nesser and Jim McMillan and Swede Youngstrom in their place. So Youngstrom and Mikulski are first team, according to Ken Crippen. Al Nesser and Jim McMillan are the second team, where the order is slightly different, with Turney saying Mikulski, Swede Youngstrom, McMillan, and Al Nesser. All very good choices on there. And I wouldn't discount Hunk Anderson from being on there. I think he's probably in that conversation as well. I don't think those guys would disagree, but I don't have a problem with what they're saying there. At center, there's no doubt George Trafton was the only center selected by the Hall of Fame. Now, to be consistent, Ken put a second center on there, and that's Doc Alexander. John Turney did the same. So Trafton and Doc Alexander are first and second team in that order by Ken Crippen, and Trafton and Alexander are the two centers chosen by John Turney for his recollection of this team. Now the halfbacks. This is where it gets a little bit interesting and has some change coming up on here. If you remember, the Hall of Fame chose Red Grange, Joe Guyon, Jim Thorpe, and Curly Lambeau. Now, Thorpe really was a outstanding player, mostly in the 19 teens. He was getting a little older a little long in a tooth by the time the 1920s rolled around. Even though he played in some of those early seasons, he really wasn't the same effective player he was 10 years earlier. We all aren't after 10 years, that's for certain. So they took Jim Thorpe off of there, basically probably made it because of his name, and was the face of the NFL that first season, the APFA anyway. And Curly Lambeau was probably more notable as being the coach that propelled people to championships, and not as much as a player. So they leave Red Grange on. Ken Crippen leaves him on his first team, puts Joe Guyon as a second team all decade. And he adds in Tony Latone of the Pottsville Maroons as a first team, who was sort of played, as Ken described, more of a wing back, sometimes fullback-ish, halfback, little hybrid thing in there. But as far as halfbacks, he puts Tony Latone as a first team, and Vern Llewellyn of the Green Bay Packers as the second team. Pretty much in agreement, John Turney chooses his three: Red Grange, Vern Llewellyn, and Tony Latone, taking Guyon off completely off of that list. So kind of an interesting matter there. The fullbacks. Ernie Nevers was the only choice at fullback by the Hall of Fame in the 1960s. Well, he is removed off of there because he really didn't have the seasons in the 1920s that would merit it at fullback. So in place, Doc Elliott made first team on Ken Crippen's list. Jack McBride makes second team. Rip King and Doc Elliott are the fullbacks on John Turney's selections. So totally different. They're totally turns out upside down, these two gentlemen, but they had some interesting names to put in there. All of them very good players in their own right. Quarterback is very similar too. If you remember, the Hall of Fame chooses Jimmy Conzelman and Patty Driscoll. Well, Crippen chooses Patty Driscoll as a first team, brings in Benny Friedman of the Detroit Wolverines and the New York Giants fame as his second team quarterback. We've talked quite a bit about him when we were talking about the Giants 100 series a year ago. John Turney, he keeps Patty Driscoll and puts him as his first selection, and also keeps Jimmy Conzelman, same as the Hall of Fame, as his second quarterback. So John Turney agrees the same. And that is an interesting thing to talk about, because Conzelman not only was a great player, but he coached, he was an owner. He did a lot of different things, as we talked about with Joe Ziemba on our 1947 podcast, sort of at the end of the Jimmy Conzelman era, as Conzelman was the head coach of the 1947 Chicago Cardinals that won the championship. And we sort of did a little review in that, if you want to go back and check that out, podcast out. But Benny Friedman also, he sort of really started making the quarterback position what more modern as we know it today, throwing the ball around the football field, and but not a bad selection either. So I think maybe I'd put all three of those guys on, or Driscoll, Konzelman, and Benny Friedman, for all 1920s, just to keep things consistent. And I think that would be all right. So there you have it. Some great players. We have player bios on all of these players in the two articles that we have on Pigskin Dispatch. First of all, the Hall of Fame's 1920 class that they selected, and having it refreshed with Ken Crippen and John Turney's inputs from their websites and their articles that they had. I'm sorry, on Clark Judge's website for Ken Crippen and John Turney's ProFootballJournal.com. So there you have it. There's some great names in football history and some reasons and some historians and their points of view. And it's also interesting to look about and talk about, as these guys really knew how to play the game and did it well enough that we're still talking about them almost 100 years later. So till next time, everybody, have a great gridiron day.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.